How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So for those of you watching, I'm so excited to have Emily Ribnik here. Emily is from Kent State Stark, their counseling services department there. And previous to that, she was working in a mental health, a 24-hour crisis center. So Emily brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to the topic that we are going to be talking about today. I think it's a much needed topic. So I don't know if you've been following, but on the Stark County Suicide Prevention Coalition Facebook page, we have been talking with people this week on the lived experience side of people that have lost people to suicide and the direct impact that that has had. But I'm excited to hear from you to talk about losing a client to suicide, because that's not something I think traditionally when we think about a suicide loss survivor that we don't always include clinicians in that piece. So I'm just really grateful to have you here and being willing to share that for other people.
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to be here. I think you're right. I think it's something that doesn't always get talked about, but I think is very important, not just for the mental health clinicians providing the care to understand and talk about, but just the general community.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you, just to kind of frame this, give us a little bit of your background? I said you were a clinician and kind of where you work now, but anything else that's, I guess, worth sharing?
Sure. I started working in the mental health field back in 2006. So I've been doing this work for about 14 years now. My first job was I worked at a 24-hour crisis center in another county. And so that center was open for 24 hours a day. We answered the suicide and crisis hotline, but we were also meeting with people one-on-one for crisis support, intervention for safety concerns, and would often be meeting and doing screens to sometimes hospitalized folks that were, really thinking and struggling, with suicidal thoughts, or maybe had even made an attempt. And we were talking to them after that because they survived their attempt. So I did that work for about 5 years. So I was really immersed in emergencies and working with suicidal folks pretty much every day, all over the spectrum of where they fell with that. And then in 2011, I transitioned into my current position, which is with the counseling services at Kent State University at Stark, primarily working with students. But along with being a clinician, I'm also a doctoral student, and my research is focused on the impact of client suicide on mental health clinicians and supervisors.
Okay, great. Got a wealth of experience. Yeah. So with this topic, you have shared with me previously, you've lost clients to suicide.
Yes.
And I guess I just want to start with, what's that initial response, hearing about losing a client, somebody that you've been working with, to suicide?
I think each time was just as hard as the time before. Working in emergency services, the potential for a client to complete suicide is higher, because that's what we worked with every single day, including with minors. And one of the clients that I lost to suicide was a minor. They were only 16 years old. And I've lost more than one client to suicide while working in emergency services and later on in my career. And I think each time somehow my stomach dropped further and further just out of my body. And that initial realization when you hear it and then when it sinks in is just a horrible gut punch. It's not any other emotion. Like I don't remember, like I wasn't immediately sad, I wasn't immediately angry, I wasn't immediately upset in any way. It felt like having the wind knocked out of me and just kind of being, like I said, just a gut punch, and then having to recover from that to even have any other response.
Yeah. So we'll touch on kind of that a little bit more, and kind of that process of, how do you continue on working in the field and that side of things. But I want to focus first on what was most helpful to you after hearing that you lost a client.
One of the things that was actually most helpful for me were my friends that were not a part of the mental health field, which may sound a little counterintuitive. I think there's a lot of assumptions that, well, other therapists will be more understanding. Well, in the immediate aftermath, I was worried that my colleagues, my coworkers would think that I was a bad therapist, or that I blamed myself. I perceived that other people would blame me or were blaming me, and not just, the family or, people who I didn't even know, but even just my own colleagues. That was a big fear. So it was hard to talk to other folks in my own field who I worked with, even in my own office, about it. And really the thing that was most helpful was I have a best friend who I've known for over 15 years who doesn't work in mental health. And, talking to her was really helpful because she was able to have such empathy, and also just not really she didn't even think about the professional side of things. It was just more, it was very personal. It was that personal support. Being able to share with family, again, also that didn't work in the field, just for that personal support, and to hear from outside folks that this wasn't something that was my fault. And through that, I was able to then slowly open up to folks in the field about it and move forward from there. But like I said, one of the things that was most helpful was actually maybe the people you wouldn't expect. I think there's an assumption that another therapist would be the most helpful or would have more empathy, but I couldn't get past that fear that I would be blamed or judged or thought of as a bad therapist, or that whoever I talked to would think that maybe I shouldn't be a therapist. So that's why, for me, I really turned to my personal supports who really had no connection to the field or what it's like working in the field. And that helped with a lot of my initial healing.
Yeah, I wouldn't have expected, I guess, that. I do think we tend to think other people don't understand because they're not walking in those same shoes. And so I think for many people, they tend to turn to their coworkers, but it also makes sense that there was that piece of how are they going to perceive me now as a clinician. So,
and I was a young clinician. I'd only really been working for a couple years. I'd only been licensed for maybe about a year and a half when this happened. And I think that really fed into that thinking a lot, being a young therapist and still wanting to prove myself. And now as a more mature therapist, I value when it happened later in my career, seeking that support from my peers and the value that had. But for those early ones, it really was my personal supports that were more helpful in the immediate.
Yeah. So what would you say was the least helpful?
I would say, especially for that very first suicide, the minor, was this experience, and it's very hard to explain, but it was this experience that nobody wanted to be the one to tell me. And because of that, I was directed to look at the client's file, and that's actually how I found out something had happened. To kind of experience that, and like I said, that feeling of nobody wanted to tell me, it felt like nobody wanted to talk to me about it. And that was really hard, because again, it fed into that there's a reason they don't want to talk to me about it, and the reason is me, where in reality, it most likely was just their own not knowing what to say or not knowing how to tell me or how to bring it up. And so that was really difficult. And it actually came up later in my career too, where a suicide of a colleague had happened. So not a client, but the suicide of a colleague. And the person who ended up telling me had known for actually a little while. And the funeral was actually coming up very soon. And, finally kind of pumped themselves up to tell me, which I really appreciated. But there was still kind of this element of, nobody wanted to tell me, or nobody wanted to send an email, or, give me a heads up. And especially that very first experience, with that feeling of that nobody wanted to take on that conversation. And it took a while before anybody did have a conversation with me. And again, as a young clinician, that was really hard. That was really, really difficult.
Sure, because how do you make sense of that? Do you think that stems from the stigma piece, or is it more about just truly not knowing how to communicate something like that?
I can't speak for the other folks. This was also, going on 10, 15 years ago. So it's been quite a bit of time.
Times were different too, sure.
Yeah, I do think that there was a genuine not knowing how to bring that up. Like, how do you prepare yourself for that conversation of telling somebody that, somebody that they provided care for, has completed suicide, has made that choice. So looking back, I do empathize with them now, with how difficult that must have been for them to watch me finding out and not knowing what to do. And when you're a therapist, we're the ones who are like supposed to know what to do. And I'm sure that, they were, dealing with that too, on their own level. So I don't think it had anything to do necessarily with stigma or anything personal with me. I really think it came down to just as human beings at that time, genuinely not knowing how to start that conversation and to give me that type of news.
Yeah, sure. So through that, what would you say, or how has that experience, even you can start with the one early on, or you had mentioned you've lost a client later on in your career as well. How has that shaped you or impacted you both personally and professionally? I mean, I look at the personal side, but even your care with ongoing work and the documentation piece, and I just wonder how that has taken a toll, maybe.
Sure. So on the professional side, I do, because of the environment I was in, working in crisis, in emergency mental health services, in a way I was lucky because I was surrounded by a lot of research and information, and we did a lot of continuing education because that was our specialty. So I was, in a way, it was comforting to have all of that information because I looked at it, and not that I didn't look at it seriously before this happened, but I did look at it with a more experienced lens, and tried to not just learn it, but know it, if that makes sense, to kind of cross that line between learning something in order to learn it and have the information to really knowing that, and taking it, to my own, like, just personal research and, reading things and learning more about suicide and suicide assessment and things that I could do to hone my professional skills. And I was in an environment where talking about suicide was very normal, asking clients questions about suicidal thoughts and had they made previous attempts. This was all a very normal part of our conversation because we were answering a 24-hour crisis line.
Sure.
So it was a conversation I literally had every single day I was at work, multiple times a day. And I think that helped because the environment didn't allow me to run away from it or avoid it, because that's what I was doing every day. And while as hard as that really was, I do think that was a good experience for me professionally. I would also say probably one of the other areas that it impacted the most professionally was as a supervisor, and initiating conversations with my supervisees about their personal experience with suicide, their professional experience with suicide, really initiating those conversations and talking to them about what may happen as a clinician, and being transparent with them about my own experiences so that they know if this happens, it doesn't equate to that you're a bad therapist or shouldn't work in this field or any of those things. But it is something that could happen as part of our jobs and part of our careers. And then the last piece, of course, being my own research that I'm doing about the impact of this on mental health clinicians and counseling supervisors.
So I think you've mostly touched on the professional side. Is there anything that you'd like to share about the personal side of how this is impacted?
On the personal side, it allowed me a lot of reflection that I don't think would have happened, and a lot of my own, yes, professional growth, but also, personal growth. This was something that happened when I was, in my mid-20s, and, it's a foundation shaker, whether it happens in your professional life or your personal life. Like I said, that gut punch doesn't change. So also finding my own interest in it and finding other avenues to advocate, while yes, that's part of my professional identity, that's also something that I do on my personal time with, memberships and even just talking to other people. So I think for me personally, it was also understanding and realizing that suicide is very real and it has real impact on other people. And, professionally, I can put the professional stuff in a box, right? The personal stuff is much more amorphous. I still don't know all the personal impacts that these losses have had. I'm still, learning about those. I think they definitely had helped me to reflect on my own value of life and my own value for the people in my life. And it was also, in a way, humbling to have that recognition that this is something that can and could touch anybody, including myself, because, like I mentioned, I've had professional losses, but I've also had personal losses in my own life to suicide.
Wow. I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around the not just the impact, but the how it changes you professionally. Are there certain things that you lean to help kind of clarify, get a better understanding? I mean, what would you say, I guess, looking at even to newer clinicians or even experienced clinicians, in terms of, I guess, offering advice, thoughts on that, all of that? That wasn't just one question, sorry.
That's a lot of questions and a lot of words. I think one thing that all clinicians have to choose to face, and I don't know that we all do, is that you may be faced with losing a client to suicide. And for many of us, it's not a question of if, it really is a question of when. And for some of us, again, depending on, where you work, again, going back to working in emergency services, the probability of that happening does go up significantly. Also the question of how many. And, it is a part of our field. And one thing that I feel has helped me was the education piece, was the fact that I persisted in my same job for several years after that loss. I did not, looking back, I would not have thought this in the moment, but looking back, I did not allow it to change my course. I was passionate about working in emergency services and suicide prevention before, and I became more passionate after, especially with that realization of what the impact really can be like. So I think there's things that we can do as clinicians to embrace the reality that suicide is there in our field, potentially also in our lives. And we have to realize that, and we have to acknowledge that. And for some of our younger clinicians, that's really hard to wrap your head around. And we need supervisors and administrators that are willing to initiate that conversation and willing to kind of put themselves out there to talk about it first, and to help them know that it's okay to also be upset by it. One of the things that I find helpful is sharing and teaching about this to other clinicians, to really put out that message of it's okay to grieve after a suicide loss of a client. It's okay to go through that grieving. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be really upset. It's also okay to question, your skills, and to reflect on, is there other things that maybe you want to learn or you want to expose yourself to now that you've had this experience? It doesn't mean you were doing anything wrong to start with, but has that opened up maybe some space for you to want to explore some other things? And I think it's a very powerful message to remind clinicians that, we're still human beings first, and a loss will be grieved, and grieving as a mental health clinician is normal, and it doesn't mean you're any less of a clinician. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to grieve just because you're a clinician, and you're allowed, and you will go through potentially that grieving process, and it'll be yours. It'll be unique to you. It's not going to be like mine. It's not going to be like the person sitting next to you or your supervisor. It's going to be yours, and it's okay to go on that, and it's okay to be a person while also being a clinician.
Sure. Well, you were talking, it made me think of some previous experiences that I have had just throughout my career of when people lose clients to suicide, the thinking about their family then, and those that have left behind, and what's that like? I mean, do you contact the family, because there's that fear of how are they going to respond to you as well.
Of course. And that's such a hard situation because, all of our interactions with a client are about the client, right? They're not about us, and that appropriately has to persist even after they're gone. And, I will share, I have never chosen to attend a funeral. But that has been my choice. I have chosen for that not to be a part of my process or my journey after one of these losses. When I lost somebody who was, in their teens, that was really hard because I did think about their family, because I'd met their family as part of, the process they were going through. I spent, several hours with their family. I had some phone calls with their family to check in on things. And, so I will always think about them to some extent. And when I think about other individuals that I've lost, whether they were a client or a colleague, I think about their families. And although I'm a suicide survivor, as a mental health clinician, my life was touched by that loss. It was touched in a unique way that is completely different from family, from friends, from that person's coworkers and other people in their life. It's in some ways a very solitary experience because, like you were just saying, we don't know that family even knew if they were in therapy or not. And it may not be our place to expose that. That wouldn't be appropriate. That wouldn't be respecting that person's legacy and who they were. And so it can be a more solitary experience, I think, as a survivor than other types of survivors, just because our work is solitary in that same way. And that's why it was so important to find my own supports, because I did not feel that I could grieve with the family, just again, personally. So that's why it made it so important to find other supports and to find a different way to grieve.
I really like how you said, this was a nice reframe, putting it in the perspective that even after that person is not living anymore, that it's still about that person. It's not about you and your emotions. And so I just wanted to say thank you for bringing it to that, that perspective. I think that's helpful. So I guess I'm going to wrap it up with one final question, but you can feel free if you think there's other things, because I know this is something that you really are A, passionate about, but also B, do a lot of education around. What recommendations or resources would you say is available for people that have lost their client to suicide? Are there quick websites or resources that you know of that you would say this is a great book to read, or something along those lines?
Yeah, actually, the American Association of Suicidology, who have dedicated their research and everything that they do about understanding suicide, they actually have resources specifically for mental health clinicians that are the survivors of a client suicide. So they actually have a task force that you can contact to kind of connect to other clinicians that have gone through this experience, but they also have an extensive resource list of different books and articles. And some of them, what I appreciate about their resource list is it's comprehensive in that some of those resources are personal stories from other clinicians, just kind of sharing their experience and what they went through, and similar to what we talked about today. And then others are, kind of the other side of the spectrum with very professional and, recommendations for how to support a supervisee, or how to be teaching our graduate students in mental health and counseling about suicide. So it really kind of runs the gamut of all these different resources, and they're organized really well. So that's really the first resource that comes to mind, because you can connect with others on a one-on-one basis. Or if you don't feel ready to do that, which some people, may not right away, there's also just material that you can kind of read and, potentially see yourself in reading about those experiences, whether it's the more personal stories, whether it's more articles. Ohio Moss actually did a study back in 2016 about this. And so that's also a published study where they talked about everything from, about 30% of clinicians that went through, mental health clinicians that went through this experience did consider leaving the field, and about another third of them considered at least temporarily leaving. So for some of us, finding those, researched responses in those types of studies, especially something from right here in Ohio, there can be some relief in that, because you can see that you are definitely not the only one having those thoughts of maybe leaving. And my experience kind of reflected what they found in that study, which was how a clinician finds out about this loss is very impactful, and can really kind of set off, do they have a positive experience and a positive journey, or does it start a little bit more rocky? And that was from a task force study back in 2016, like I said, right here in Ohio. And then the American Association of Suicidology and their resources would be probably the first two things that pop to mind of just something to look into. The AAS has the potential to connect, like I said, with other survivors. The Ohio study, I at least personally found helpful to read over, even though it was many years after, my experience, just to kind of see myself in the responses. And that was helpful to see.
Yeah, and I think it just helps you feel like you're not alone, because there's other people that are feeling that same way.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know I did say that was my last question, but I just thought, as you brought it up again, how you were notified, and I thought, well, maybe people don't know. I mean, who's the best person for that information to come from? Yeah. Is that their supervisor? Is it somebody from administration? Do you have thoughts around that?
A lot of the studies really indicate that whoever is identified as the person's supervisor is really one of the better resources to get that information. Also because they can also initiate a conversation of what do you need, right? Because there's the first part of the conversation of, here's the information, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. But that person, especially in a supervisor role, whether it's clinical supervision or administrative supervision, they're also in a role that can start initiating the conversations of, what do you need right now? You know, do you, and I've worked with, you know, clinicians who talk about, you know, I needed to work that day because I needed something to do. And so that's what they need. But then they, you know, needed some other time away. Others, you know, needed to leave immediately. They just, you know, couldn't stay at work. And either response is fine. But one of the helpful things about the supervisor being the deliverer of that information is that they're also in a role to start addressing, what do you need right now? They can also approve those things, which again, I realize sounds very procedural, but in the moment, to be given the news by someone who then you can ask, well, if I don't know that I can stay today, who can say, and that's okay, so let's have you go home, or I really do want to work today, and then they could check in with that person later to make sure that they still, you know, want to do that as some time goes by.
Yeah.
You know, that combination of roles is actually really helpful. I know when I found out, one of my first round of questions, and again, this is just my own personal way of dealing with things, was I started asking questions of, you know, is there going to be a review? Am I going to get calls from the state board? Like, is the licensure board going to know about this and call me? Like, is there going to be an investigation? And again, a supervisor is able to answer some of those questions in a little bit more definitive way, just having that information. It doesn't mean that a peer telling somebody that information is bad. That's not at all what I'm saying. But in so much of the research, it really comes down to who is seen as a leader by that person, who's really seen as a supervisor or kind of someone that's trusted in that role, can be really beneficial to deliver that news and be able to initiate that follow-up conversation of, what do you need right now, and is also in a position where they can help make that happen.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that
Yeah.
self-care piece afterwards. Yeah. Any final comments or things that you want to add?
Sure. There was one thing they didn't necessarily touch on that I think is important to put out there, was, if anyone's familiar with the grieving process, anger is in there. And I think something that we don't always talk about is that, especially, maybe not especially, but at least in my experience losing clients to suicide, I became very angry at the system. I wasn't necessarily angry at the person or, you know, anybody in their lives. I was angry at, you know, why did it take so long to get this appointment? Or why didn't they get a reminder call? Or why didn't their insurance cover this treatment or care for them? Or why couldn't they get insurance? Like, I was more angry at this big amorphous system that I couldn't actually touch or talk to. And honestly, that anger is a lot more what has spurred my advocacy with the system, is, you know, comes from that. And at least, again, that was my experience. I think it's a piece of grieving this type of loss, especially as a clinician, that, again, we don't necessarily talk about a lot out loud. But that anger at the system was very real for me. And over time, I was able to channel that in a positive direction. But, you know, it was hard. I remember being really bitter for a while. Again, not at a person or anything like that, but again, just at this big amorphous system that so many of us are already frustrated by, whether you're a consumer or working in the system or representing the system. And it just kind of took that to another level.
How did you move past that or through that then?
I don't know that I have 100% moved past it or through it, because I will still get frustrated with system level things. However, as I've been able to navigate my career and understand the system more, it doesn't necessarily mean that I like the system more all the time, but that knowledge has allowed me to try to influence the system, to advocate within the system in a way that can hopefully be effective and beneficial. It spurred me to understand and want to understand the system better and understand where there were maybe gaps that could be addressed, and also what are the big gaps that are too big for one person to try to address. You know, I think that was really important. So I still, you know, get frustrated by the system, and I think that anger still lingers to a certain extent, and I just try to use it to do the advocacy work and to try to prevent the situations from happening again.
Well, Emily, just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience with us and all of your advocacy work. I know I really appreciate hearing your voice at our coalition meetings, and I know other people do too, so thank you for that.
Sure.
All right. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.